It's 11 o'clock. Yes, thank you, sir. Well, thank you for coming. Quick commercial, Auburn Historical Museum, the corner of South and School Street, open Tuesdays and Saturdays, 9:30 to 12:30. We have an 1850 shoemaker's bench, complete with all the tools and equipment needed to make shoes. We have a Civil War uniform in lovely condition, and we have a 1930 football uniform and a 1930 ball glove. I can tell you why some people play with one finger outside the glove. You know how they have one finger outside the glove? I can show you why on that one.
I'd like to know that.
See? We have a lot of neat stuff. So please come. So, how many of you have heard of Mary Roberts Reinhart? Good job, good job. Usually I get blank faces. So I can prove that she touched each one of your lives in some way. I have done this talk maybe 8 or 9 times and I've never been proved wrong yet. So, even Sandy, in some way.
Did she fish?
Yes. Okay, so in case you want to know, the study of Mary Roberts Reinhart is called Reinhartania.
Okay.
She was the original multitasker. She did so many things all at once, it's absolutely impossible to do a chronological talk. So it'll jump around a bit. If you get lost or confused, tough. Let me know, and I'll be happy to help you out. She was born August 12th, 1876 in Pittsburgh. She died September 22nd, 1958 in New York City. In high school, high tech. Yep, oh, there's my statement of fact. See? In high school, notice how she had the lace to hide her collarbone. She sold 2 stories to the local paper for $1. Her father was a frustrated inventor. He was also incredibly lazy and never made any effort to market anything. I invented this, anybody care? Okay. She wanted to be a doctor, which was very unusual for the time, but there was no money. But her uncle paid for her to go to nursing school. And she graduated as a nurse in 1896. She said it was very good for her because she learned all the tragedy of the world under one roof. And as many young nurses did, she married a doctor, Major Reinhart, and that's the best picture of him ever taken, according to his family. Sad. She had 3 sons. Stanley Jr., born in 1897, Alan, born in 1900, and Fred, who was called Ted, in 1902. She was a hypochondriac, although she did have some real things wrong with her. She had a very stressful life, and she was a type A personality, so you know how well that went. She talked twice as fast as other people. I relate to her. She loved to go camping and canoeing and fishing and horseback riding. Everybody has faults. So what? Why would you care? She was America's first female Horatio Alger. Rags to riches with terrible adversity. Well, so what sort of adversity? When she was 5 years old, she was kidnapped by a friend of the family who took her. She had gotten, it was near her birthday, she'd gotten a matching necklace, ring, and bracelet set. The friend stole them and left Mary in an locked in an abandoned outhouse. She climbed out and found her way for home. One day she was out walking with her auntie by the river, and all of a sudden the river started churning and boiling and bubbling, and all this debris kept floating down the river, followed by bodies of cattle and swine and people. It was the Johnstown flood. Her father committed suicide, thinking he was a failure. It turned out he had invented a bobbin that would have revolutionized the sewing industry. If he had but shown it to anyone, he'd have made millions. The family tried to keep it a secret. They just called or notified Mary at school that your father has passed away. Come home. she got a newspaper to pass the time on the train. The newspaper reported the suicide, saying he drank and was pushed over the edge by a letter from a daughter named Mary. I don't know if that was true or not. Speaking of her training, on the second day of training, she had to clean out the OR, picked up a bucket and looked, and there was a foot. She was left-handed, so naturally her teacher smacked her one every time she tried to use her left hand. She and her husband took a trip, probably a honeymoon trip, to New York City to the stock market. They were there for the great crash of the 1890s, at which point Dr. Reinhart lost every penny he had on this earth. Her grandmother Roberts tripped over the hem of a bathrobe, fell down the stairs and broke her neck. She had a young cousin killed by a train. A young niece accidentally drank poison and died. Her mother had a stroke, was unable to speak, was mobility impaired, drew herself a nice hot bath, fell in the tub and was scalded to death. My second favorite, my favorite's coming up. This is my second favorite. She brought her husband a horse for his birthday. He got on it, the horse ran away. The horse stopped suddenly, threw Dr. Reinhart on his head onto a concrete block, then promptly rolled over on him. Mary's on the other side of the road going, "I killed my husband with his birthday present, oh my God, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead." He had a broken leg and a concussion and was a little strange for 6 months, but then he was fine. Now my favorite. They had a place in Bar Harbor, Maine, quite a nice place. After he died, she went up there for the first time in 1947. There was a Filipino chef named Reyes. He had been drinking. She gave him an order to make something for dinner that he didn't know how to make. He was miffed. So he pulled out a gun, put it in her face, and pulled the trigger. It misfired. He pulled the trigger again. It misfired again. She took off running, leaping over furniture. She was 70. She bolted into the library to call the police, and there was a young man there waiting to be interviewed for a gardening job. "Can't talk right now. There's somebody trying to murder me. Come back tomorrow." Oddly, he never showed again. Reyes got 2 large kitchen knives and was chasing her through the house with the kitchen knives. She was sprinting ahead of him. The chauffeur tackled him, but the Reyes got off him and kept running. Finally, the servants and Ted tackled him and subdued him, Ted getting slightly injured in the experience. The next day, Reyes hanged himself in jail. The priest came and said, well, clearly he was insane. And of course, Mary paid for the funeral. A few months later, Mary Roberts Reinhart was the first international celebrity to go public with breast cancer and to say she had had a radical mastectomy. No offense to Angelina Jolie, but it's been done before. And then there were her children. Stanley weighed 9 pounds at birth. Mary weighed 96. Yeah, ouch. 2-year-old Ted drank carbolic acid. Mary threw him into the sink and poured cider vinegar down his throat, which neutralized the acid. He was fine. The boys ran a rubber hose from the gas pipe. They turned the jet on and blew bubbles. Stan Jr. said it was only when we thought of lighting them with a match that the ceiling got burnt. They figured out how to shoot pigeons on the roof of the church across the street when the bells were ringing, so the pigeons dropped mysteriously at the feet of the policeman on the beat. He figured it out and came knocking on the door. Alan was fascinated by railroad torpedoes. Now, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, trains didn't have radios. So there'd be signals to tell the train when they had to stop and when it was unsafe. If it was a heavy fog, they put these on the track. They were about the size of a quarter, and they had explosives in them. When the train ran over it, there was a big bang, and the engineer knew to stop the train. Alan figured out how to make one all by himself, and he set it off by hitting it with a dumbbell. And Mary writes, a stupendous explosion resulted, and I rushed to the window to see a small boy, singed to the eyebrows and hair, totter out of a cloud of smoke, and dazed sit down on the drive. What became of these little darlings? Did they live? They became the publishing company of Farrar and Reinhart, now known as Holt, Reinhart, and Winston. They all died of old age.
Oh my goodness.
So, what was the result of all this? Mary said, well, it's either a setback or a wonderful adventure, take your pick. They formed Mary Roberts Reinhart into the most famous author in the world for more than 50 years. She was the celebrity. She wrote more best-selling novels than any other American writer in the world, or any other American writer in history, but Stephen King is catching up. She wrote over a longer period than almost any other American writer. In the late 1940s, there was a study of the 100 best-selling novelists in the world. That means Kipling, Oscar Wilde, James M. Barrie, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. Mary was number one. She was admired and loved, so why did she write? Well, Dr. Reinhart, he was a GP. It was a depression. He got paid in chickens and vegetables. She had 3 kids. She had a house. They needed the money. At the age of 27, she began to write. She sold 45 short stories that year, mostly to the Saturday Evening Post. She ran the house, took care of the kids, and supported everybody. In 1927, The Circular Staircase. I do have a first edition copy that's at home. It sold 1.25 million copies. She could create an atmosphere of a place and humanize the characters with believable details. She would draw you into the story. It felt like you were there. You would be reading one of Mary's books and stop and realize how quiet it had suddenly gotten. She would build them around a genuine mystery that the reader was challenged to figure out. Many books were built around a big secret. And sometimes the secret didn't have anything to do with the murder, but it was still cool. The books erupted into the most startling plot twists imaginable. Carefully plotted, detailed maps, one of the first authors to do maps in the books. So you'd see the murder was here, they escaped here, the people were over here, the guy in the kitchen was here, you know. She wrote with a favorite fountain pen, even when typewriters were big. And she bought ink by the gallon. Once she paid the bills, she wrote to get a few luxuries, like private schools for the boys. More like confinement centers, but you know. She says, I write to make a little money. I was not compelled to write. My husband was a professional man who resents my desire to earn a little money for myself. Why should I not? He says it was unnecessary, but I've made $50,000 a year, and 8 years ago I never made $1. This is during Depression.
Wow.
She wrote for money, but also to escape from poverty, illness, and an unhappy marriage. It was self-preservation. She always said, I could earn money, but I could not keep it. Anybody with a sob story got money from her. So she had nothing, so Dr. Reinhart had to take over her finances. She fell for every sob story that came anywhere near her. And she donated huge sums for suicide prevention and medical charities. By 1918, she made more money than any other author in the world, except Sir James M. Barrie, and we know that he wrote Peter Pan. Dr. Reinhart was jealous. He said, oh, here's the kids, by the way. Don't they look sinister? And there's the Circular Staircase original cover. Sadly, I don't have that. Dr. Reinhart said, all you write is trash, pulp fiction, lowbrow. And Mary said, and? In her books, motherhood was hard work, but a joy. In her books, marriage was always depicted as a horror story. The husbands were cold-hearted philanderers. Cold-hearted, yes, but there's no proof he was a philanderer. But back in those days, they didn't report things like that. She also wrote Broadway plays, not with a lot of success. And she wrote the screenplays of her novels, which she hated doing. I already wrote it once. After her sons were grown and started their own publishing business, that's another movie she wrote, she switched over to them. And she wrote for books for them, 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6 a year for 30 years. Every one of them a #1 bestseller.
Wow.
And unlike Agatha Christie, she never repeated a plot. Well, how many times has Hercule Poirot solved the mystery with the spills of paper on the mantelpiece? So what else did she do? She liked to vacation out west. She was one of the first white women to walk the Grand Canyon and Baja California. She walked 12 miles a day. Fished. Didn't lie to you, she fished. She did all sorts of stuff, and she dragged the boys along. They seem to have enjoyed it. She had books written about her. I have one over there. She got to be very close with the Blackfeet Indians and discovered that they were freezing, they didn't have enough blankets, and many of them were going blind for trachoma. And they were hungry. The white men had shoveled them off to reservations and taken all their hunting grounds, and they had nothing. So one of her very close friends was Teddy Roosevelt. And she went to Teddy and said, "What do we do about this?" And Teddy said, "Go see Franklin Lane, the Secretary of the Interior. He's in charge of the Indian Affairs." So Mary went to him and said, explained what was wrong with the Blackfeet, said all they need is a good-sized train with blankets, food, and the medicine for the trachoma. Ooh, congressional appropriation, financial difficulties, logistics of getting a train like that together. They're lovely people, I'll sure they'll manage. And this is the only time she ever did it. She leaned across his desk and said, "Do you know who I am? I can write such a story about you that your family will not speak to you for the next 50 years. I'm going to lunch and I'll be back at 2. Let me know when the train leaves." She got back at 2, the train had just left with everything on it. The Blackfeet named her Running Eagle and called her a warrior woman and inducted her into the tribe.
Whoa.
Now, in World War I, the Red Cross wanted a representative in the field to see how are the hospitals running, what do the hospitals need, and we need publicity. Nurse, Mary, would you mind going over to Belgium and France and England? You know, stay in the big cities, make inquiries, check with the people coming from the hospitals, see what we can do for them. Dr. Reinhart said, "Fine, what trouble could she get into?" Some men are idiots, no offense. Mary used the Saturday Evening Post as her passport. She became the only female correspondent on the front in World War I. America didn't know what the daily life was like in Europe, she told them. Belgium gave Mary a pink card pass. There were 3 other pink card passes. The Minister of War, the Prime Minister, and the King. This was Mary Roberts Reinhart. You just stand back and say, "Yes, ma'am, whatever you want, ma'am. Please don't write about me." She did use a typewriter in the trenches because you couldn't carry the ink and the fountain pen. She went in the trenches in uncomfortable and impossible conditions. She was within 200 yards of the German front. Now I'll say yesterday I saw 1917. Just hand it the Oscar. It is fabulous and heart-wrenching. She saw the enormous inequities of war from the point of view of a nurse and a mother. She wrote about Belgian soldiers marching cheerfully wearing bedroom slippers. She was bombed in Dunkirk. She kept going. She wrote, "Stop knitting scarves and send food, especially beans." Food arrived by the ton. She went in the trenches in a hiking suit and boots And a fur coat, because you got it. She had bodyguards who only just managed to keep her alive. She was the only person to interview the Belgian king for the Saturday Evening Post, of course. She went to the trenches. Oh, she was the first reporter to report that the Germans were using poison gas. But the Saturday Evening Post wanted America to remain neutral and knew that would click it over. It was a male reporter for the New York Times that was published, but Mary reported it first. She went in the trenches in France. The Americans refused to believe her stories about the terrible conditions in towns and hospitals. Everything's desolation. It is mud. There are bodies everywhere. But she said, for the love of God, send food, send bandages, send clothing. An avalanche of things came. I'm sure she's exaggerating, but Mary wants this. We will do it. Because I am a woman, I cannot die for my country, but I am doing a far harder thing. I am giving a son in the service of his country. Stan Jr. enlisted with his parents' permission. He survived the war. All this work did satisfy her need for real life and adventure. War is not two great armies meeting in the clash and frenzy of battle. War is a boy carried on a stretcher looking up at God's blue sky with bewildered eyes that are soon to close. War is a woman carrying a child that has been injured by a shell. War is the flower of a race, battered, hungry, and bleeding, up to its knees in filthy water. War is an old woman burning a candle before the Mater Dolorosa for the son she has given for king and country. And she did not mince words. Then the enlistments fell off. They drafted everybody they could draft. The Saturday Evening Post asked her to write an article promoting joining the army. She did, crying the whole time, because she knew what they were in for. Well, what else did she do? She came back to Washington, did a publicity tour, got back to France, just happened to get there November 11th, 1918. Came back, arrived in Washington just in time for the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And while she was in France, she, of course, ran into Black Jack Pershing and was the only one to interview him on Armistice Day. You don't mess with her. I don't care who you are. So, after the war, that's it. Now that's Keno, her bull terrier. She lived in a haunted apartment in Washington. It belonged to a senator who died there not salubriously. She saw a round white light bobbing around. Both Mary and Dr. Reinhart saw something like a black curtain blowing in the wind in the bedroom. They went in, there was no wind and there was no curtain. Keno ran into the bedroom after a toy, turned around, crawled out on his stomach, whining in terror. This is where Mary's mother died, in this apartment. The minute she died, the haunting stopped. Apparently, mother was just as scary as daughter when she got on the other side. Now, what would you do if you were in a haunted apartment and manifestations appeared before your eyes? She wrote The Red Lamp and sold it for $45,000. Now talk about her books. With the publication of The Circular Staircase, she became a success and it changed everything. She bought a car, had a chauffeur, got a nicer house. She didn't have to churn out short stories. She invented the Had She But Known school of mysteries, as in, Eleanor goes into the study and gets hit with a frying pan by Betty, is the title of the chapter. Okay, Eleanor's going to go into the study and Betty's going to hit her in the head with a frying pan. Got it. She writes so compellingly, so excitingly, and so beautifully that when Betty actually does paste Eleanor one, it comes as a surprise. After The Circular Staircase is The Man in Lower 10. And The Circular Staircase and The Man in Lower 10 are the earliest works by an American author to still be in print as works of entertainment and not classical literature. They combine mystery, adventure, and especially with this one, some humor, and suspense and horror. She wrote a novel in about 3 or 4 weeks. The After House in 1913. This is based on an 1897 murder. Thomas Brand was convicted of an axe murderer of 3 people aboard the lumber schooner Henry Fuller. Mary, to do research, this sounds like a good book. She read the court records, she did all the research, and she decided Brand was innocent. He didn't do it. So when she wrote the book, she had somebody else do it, the one she thought was guilty. She just picked, once the After House came out, the interest was revived, and she presented the evidence she had found in the trial transcripts. That evidence was concocted. Brand was paroled. They investigated further. He was innocent. And the first thing Brand did when he got out of jail was come to Mary and thank her and say, I really am innocent and thank you for getting me out of there. She wrote a book about it. And the Henry Fuller became the Benry Muller. And all the names were not changed all that much. Oh my God, was she sued. And she lost. And what happened? Well, a few other things happened at this time. But the main thing that happened is, this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to people living or dead is purely coincidental or wishful thinking. That appears in every movie, every television show, and every book of fiction written ever since then. Mary had a hand in that. There was a TV movie all about this in 1957. I can't find a copy of it. Claudette Colbert played Mary. In 1921, she wrote a romance, Lost Ecstasy. Ecstasy was very successful. Hollywood paid her $15,000. In 1931, I Take This Woman, starring Carol Lombard and Gary Cooper. Okay, now we're getting into how did Mary touch your life? Sandy wants to know. 1914, the first Tish books, and there must be 20 Tish books. I have 2 of them here. Miss Letitia Carberry and her companions, Aggie and Lizzie, did things forbidden to women at that time. They drove race cars. They piloted dirigibles. They drove ambulances in World War I. They did stunt work in silent movies. They hunted sharks and grizzly bears. And in later books, they worked out complex capers designed to promote romance, which always backfired. They were the favorite books of Madeline Pugh Davis. We all know who Madeline Pugh Davis was. You people have got to get out more. Madeline Pugh Davis combined Lizzie and Aggie into Ethel Mertz and turned Tish into Lucy Ricardo. I'll let you contemplate on that while I figure out what I do with my soda. I think I stuck it in the pocket. So, without Mary Roberts Reinhart, you don't have I Love Lucy. I'm going to be smart and let that sit a minute. The Door. The Door is the first mystery written in which the primary male servant in the household is the killer. The butler did it. Her son Alan came to visit Mary in New York on a break from school. He'd been experimenting with alcohol. And he was kind of boozy and unshaven, and Mary introduced him to President Warren and Jean Harding. Your kids exist to embarrass you. She wrote a Spanish play, Mirandel Carmen, on Broadway as Spanish Love. It was a big hit. She did the casting and picked an unknown actor for the lead, William Powell, the Thin Man. 1938, The Wall. This is a corker. Set in a disguised Bar Harbor. Not Bar Harbor, different, completely different. It's a murder and a love story. The Saturday Evening Post paid $65,000 for serial rights. Considered one of her best works. I will tell you, some of her books were clunkers. They sold, but ew. 1932, The first Miss Pinkerton book, Saturday Evening Post, $50,000. Warner Brothers, $30,000. The movie was Joan Blondell and George Brent. Miss Pinkerton's a nurse who solves mysteries. Her health was always an issue. Several operations for female trouble. She needed gallbladder surgery. The staff psychiatrist came in, looked at the number of operations, and said, "I've been wondering what you're trying to escape from." Escape? Well, of course, all these operations, what do they mean? Do you dislike your work? Now look, I had gallstones. I saw myself. Don't tell me I could manage gallstones just to stop working. Well, of course you could. I often wondered if he was right. Thinking she was dying, again, in 1933, she decided, for the sake of the children, to write an autobiography, to write about her family, their roots. Not for sale, just for the kids. Rumors of an autobiography leaked. Good Housekeeping beat out the Saturday Evening Post for serial rights. $45,000, and this is my first edition. One of the best books I've ever read. And I read it and said, no, she didn't do those things. And this is only the first half of her life. Well, she still had 20 years to go. Yeah, she did every one of them. I checked it out. Inside Story, 1934. A policeman said, "Trouble is my business," 5 years before Raymond Chandler wrote Philip Marlowe saying the same thing. Now, her greatest work was an adaptation, I have to see where I am, yeah, of The Circular Staircase. Now, she did a novel every 4 weeks. She spent years on this one. She worked with a collaborator. She wanted it to be perfect. It was a gem of formal complexity. The heroine was an old lady described as an indomitable spinster, published before a short story came out about Miss Marple. The play was an enormous success. No one could guess the ending. It was very suspenseful. Before TV, before popular radio stories, few movie mysteries, and they were silent anyway. It was her biggest success. Everyone left the room as it is certain the criminal is gone. The French window door opened. A stealthy figure passed through it, silently to be swallowed up in the darkness of the terrace. And poor Lizzie, entering the room, saw a hand covered with blood reach back and horribly, through the broken pane, refasten the lock. Lizzie screamed madly. Pay attention. Then suddenly, traveling swiftly from left to right across the shades of the French windows, there appeared a growing circle of brilliant white light. Inside the circle was the shadow of a gigantic bat. His sign, 1926, the bat. Now, my father, who was as wide as he was tall, was not given to physical activity under any circumstances. When he was 19 years old, he saw the bat and ran all the way home. There were 6 simultaneous road companies, including one in London. It ran 878 performances on Broadway. In the first year, Mary made $85,496.78. The total royalties were $200,902.35. Her share of the profits, $137,663.09. On top of the royalties, the bat was made for silent movies. The script was done by a young man named Stephen Vincent Benet, who went on to do other things. Mary made so much money from the bat, she paid $46,612 in taxes for 1 year. A quote from the book, and this is funny when I finish telling you all this. Ministers mentioned the bat in sermons. Cranks wrote fanatic letters denouncing him as one of the 7-headed beasts of the apocalypse. There were Bat Club sandwiches, bat cigarettes. He became a fad, a catchword, a national figure. And yet he was walking death. Death itself had become a toy of publicity. In 1933, R.C.A. Victor put the bat out as one of the first audiobooks. Bob Kane, y'all know Bob Kane. Get lives, people. Leave the house. Bob Kane named 3 influences for his greatest creation. Oh, no. Oh, I forgot. There's the playbill. There's the play. And here's good old Bob. 3 influences on his greatest creation. Douglas Fairbanks Jr.'s Zorro. Leonardo da Vinci's Ornithopter. And Mary Roberts Reinhart the Bat. Without Mary Roberts Reinhart, no Batman.
Oh my gosh.
The circle moving across the room with the shadow of the bat in it, it's the bat signal. And all the stuff in the book about bat cigarettes, bat this, bat that. Mary did that. So I'm getting there. I should have most of you by now. Oh dear. Mary tried to ignore the fact that her husband was dying, so did he. But he did die in 1932. Their marriage was not ideal. It always came to the fact that she was famous and he wasn't. She did ads. She wrote a lot. She wrote a lot after he died, and she wrote excellent books and worked without repeating herself. Mary often wrote about escape from the standard restraints of a woman's life. She could get $75,000 to serialize a story in Good Housekeeping during the Depression. She did a lot of propaganda work during World War II. At the end, she was bedridden, doing a series of heart attacks. Her last book, 1952, was The Swimming Pool, first rate and a bestseller. Now, every one of her books had the last chapter was called The Last Chapter. And this is the last chapter. Mary was the inspiration for my favorite contemporary author, Charlotte MacLeod. This is her book on biography of Mary. Charlotte wrote 4 different series, 2 under the names of Alyssa Craig and 2 under her known name. They're the best books, mysteries, cozies I have ever read. And I love them and reread them on a regular basis. Charlotte MacLeod was an ad executive in Worcester and decided she was tired of that. She moved to Maine and became a school teacher. When she retired, she wrote the mystery stories, which were all New York Times toppies. So without Mary, you don't have Charlotte MacLeod. Without Charlotte MacLeod, you don't have Jessica Fletcher was inspired, the authors say, by Charlotte MacLeod. I heard an interview they did with Charlotte, and she said, yes, all those things that Jessica did, I did, except I was married. And so was Jessica, but her husband died. So yes, never had children, yes, wrote all the mysteries, yes, did all that, but none of my relatives have ever been accused of murder. I have never stumbled across a dead body. And I can drive. So that is what I want to tell you about Mary Roberts Reinhart. And I hope you'll go get a book and read it.